everybody. I'm the guest moderator for Film Independent, and I am so fortunate to have with us here the director-producer, Stanley Nelson of Attica, of course, and the co-director and producer, Traci A. Welcome. And thank you so much for your thorough and devastating examination of one of the most shocking and disturbing incidents in our nation's history.
It was 70% black and brown prisoners, all white guards. What could go wrong?
Grab the guards, grab the keys.
All hell broke loose.
Put your hands in the air and you will not be harmed.
You will not be harmed. You will not be harmed. But that was bullshit.
Somebody had to take a stand.
I want to jump in and just ask you both initially. 63% of the inmates in Attica, if I remember correctly, were black and brown. And your film points to sort of the continuous problems with mass incarceration and the disproportionate imprisonment of and mistreatment of black and brown people. And then, of course, the abuses that were rampant in the American prison system and the desperate need for reform. Since this film has come out, have you heard from anybody in law enforcement or corrections who saw your film and has any ideas about reform? What have you heard since this film has its way?
I personally haven't heard anything from law enforcement at all. I don't know if Traci has, but no, I haven't heard anything.
No, I haven't, but I would certainly welcome that dialogue if it happened.
Yeah. I thought it was so powerful the way you wove in the statements of the prisoners, the former prisoners who were there, and could talk with so much visceral memory of it all. I guess my first question is, do you think something like this could happen again today, 50 years later?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think that, there's over 2 million people in prison in the U.S. today. So, and I don't think prison conditions are that much better. Prisons are still being built, kind of away from the communities where so many of the people come from. Their guards oftentimes still are just seen as, a place to work and earn a living, and there's very little training. So I don't see why something like this couldn't happen again. But Traci, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you asked that, Claudia, because they're right now in Rikers Island, just a couple miles from where I'm sitting. There's a pretty horrific situation that's been unfolding at the prison. There's horrible overcrowding. I'm sorry, it's a jail. It's not even a prison. So these people haven't even been convicted of any crimes. Most of them just can't pay the bail to get out of the jail. There's horrible overcrowding. There are images coming out of dozens of people crammed into a cell meant for one. There's violence, there's awful conditions there. And not too long ago, there was a group of city elected officials that toured the prison, and one of them left and said, this could be another Attica. So I think that pretty clearly says that the answer to that question is yes, absolutely.
And I was surprised to hear, if it was in your film or just if I read somewhere, that there have been lots of prison revolts, even in the past few years. And this one was one, I was maybe 15 when this happened. And I remember hearing about it, but I didn't know much about it. And I really appreciated learning about what the impetus behind it was. And I know, Stanley, you said you wanted to make this film for a long time, and it's the 50th anniversary. Was that what propelled you, or what prompted you to make it now? What was it?
I think, like so many people, I knew the broad outlines of it. What was never talked about, as far as I knew when it happened, was kind of why the prisoners had rebelled, why they had taken over the prison. Almost like, well, of course they're not happy. They're in jail, and so it didn't really ever go beyond that veneer. And I had thought about it, maybe 20 or 30 years, because I, wanted to know what happened and really wanted to understand. But I think as time went on, I realized that the guys in the yard, the former prisoners, were getting older, and this was probably the best chance of getting them a good number of them, while their stories were still intact, and that once we started filming, as Traci can tell you, the words just poured out of them. It was almost like they were waiting, just for in many cases for somebody to ask them and talk to them about what had happened.
Yeah, I thought it was great that you got so many of them, and then the journalists that were there to cover it, and the guy that worked for Rockefeller. Did you approach any of the guards, the former guards, or any of them still around?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, our goal starting out was to really tell a 360-degree story and talk to all of the people that were touched by this. I've said a lot of times that this film, the story of Attica, is a lot like that parable of the blind man and the elephant, where depending on what part of it you touched, it really kind of colored and informed your experience of it. So I certainly spent as much time trying to reach out to the guards and also former civilian employees who were hostages as the prisoners. I got in contact with about 5 of them, had extensive conversations with 3, all of whom had agreed to be in the film. And I talked to them over the course of last year, just like the prisoners and the families. And ultimately, a couple of days before we were going to film, they all decided not to be in the film. So,
wow,
yeah,
that's interesting. Well, but their families did, which was very helpful, and
yes,
sort of getting perspective.
Yeah, because it was that we sort of tell the story of Attica, not just the prison, but help people to understand that this was a community and a place before it was a prison. And you really kind of need to understand that in order to really make sense of the dynamics of what was happening with race inside the prison.
Absolutely. The prisoners talk about the beat down police and the horrible conditions they were compelled to live in. People have just seen the film, but can you discuss a little bit about the specifics of what they were enduring? I mean, I know they were treated inhumanely, and I know the roll of toilet paper and all of that, but more specifics would be great.
Yeah, Traci, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, you hear sort of the prisoners articulate what is a really kind of sophisticated call for reform in the prison. I mean, there were the sanitary things that you hear them talk about, like the toilet paper, the showers. There were also labor demands. Attica was a prison where if you were an able-bodied person, you had to work. That continues to be true, by the way, at Attica to this day. And what also continues to be true is that they make pennies. And so one of those demands was for minimum wage. It was a place where all of the mail was censored. It was read and then censored. And because there were no Spanish speaking guards, if you got mail in a language other than English, then it just got thrown away. The Muslim prisoners were not able to practice their religion openly. There was no imam at the prison, and so there were demands for religious intolerance. So it really was, an articulation by the prisoners of kind of the full scale reforms that they wanted to see, that to this day, a lot of people are still not able to enjoy those rights in prison.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important that the indignities, and the horrors were small scale, like getting only 1 roll of toilet paper a month, which is small scale in a way, but it's pretty major. And until the huge acts that were happening to them, the beat downs and the other things. And if, as they say in the film, if they reported anything or tried to complain, they were retaliated against.
I was shocked to hear that Attica is still open and still has prisoners in it, because I would have thought after something like that you would close it.
Yeah, I think one thing that really comes through in the film is that Attica as a character, it's just such a creepy place. It's like these 30 or 40 foot walls. The people talk about they coming over a hill and just seeing it there, like, oh my God, what is this place? It almost like looks like there should be a moat around it and a drawbridge, fort in Europe. So I mean, it's just like an imposing, horrible place, and it's still there.
Yeah.
It's still, and people are still imprisoned.
You were able to get so much archival footage, which I thought was really powerful, and even the recordings of Nixon being pretty damn racist and big surprise. And, the conversations he had with Rockefeller and all of that, that must have been quite a process in compiling all of that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I've done a number of historical films, and that we try to do from the first day is to find all the archival footage that we possibly can, and we go from the first day, to the last day. That it's really an interesting piece, but so many times, the things that we see on TV are, the news director says, oh, the anniversary of Attica is coming up in a week, pull some clips, and we see the same clips over and over again. And nobody has really taken the time or the effort to kind of really dig and try to find, everything that we possibly could be found, and we found a lot of just incredible stuff. I mean, it's hard for me to even describe the archival. I mean, all I can say, people have seen it. All I can say is, you got to see the film to believe the archival footage and stills and phone conversations between Nixon and Rockefeller.
How hard was it to find the former prisoners? You found so many people that just had such powerful recollections. That seems like that would be an arduous process as well.
Yeah, and in some ways it was, it's odd to say, but it was helped by the pandemic in the sense that, I, like all of us, was kind of in my little pandemic work box. But it really gave me the time and space to spend not only finding people, but having conversations and cultivating those relationships. One of the things that was really helpful as far as the prisoners was concerned was when they got their settlement in 2000, the judge who oversaw the distribution of that money allowed every single surviving prisoner to come into his courtroom and talk as long as they wanted about what had happened to them on September 13th, 1971, or call in over phone. And there's a transcript of that. So I spent a lot of time reading through that and trying to, figure out 20 years after that, who might still be around, who seemed to have a compelling story, and then just sort of systematically went about contacting every single person that I could. And as you can imagine, it wasn't something that everybody was jumping to kind of revisit with a stranger over the phone. It was a profound tragedy for every single person, and a trauma for every single person that experienced it. And that goes from the prisoners to the families, to also the media, everybody that this has touched. It kind of sticks with them. And so, there were some people that weren't willing to, but fortunately for us, there were enough people who were really courageous and gracious enough to sort of sit with me and talk about it and go back there for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the central things is that Traci gave people the space to either participate or not. We just want to talk, and if you want to do it, then great. One of the things we didn't want to do is the thing that producers are so great at, is trying to convince people to talk. To say, oh yeah, it's going to be really good for you to open up, and tell your story, because it might not be good for people to open up and tell their story. So we wanted to kind of lay out what we wanted to do and let people make the choice and give them the space, to make the choice.
And what did you hear from
that, Claudia? Obviously, that we made this in 2020, so there was the extra sort of allowing people to say no because there's a pandemic and they might not be interested in, understandably coming to do a shoot with us. So it really was just kind of allowing people the space for whatever, felt comfortable for them.
And what did you hear after they revisited that? Did you hear, did it feel cathartic to some of them? What was the kind of feedback you got from the prisoners after they did go and talk about it with you?
Well, I'll say, and Stanley can talk about this too, because at this point, I think most, if not all of them, have seen the film. So I don't want to speak for them, but the sense that I got is that having the space and the platform and this level of visibility to talk about, to tell the truth about what happened. I don't know that they would say it feels like justice for them, but maybe something close to it. When something so horrible happens to you, when you're harmed by your own government in the way that all of these people were, it does scar you. And it just kind of is an open wound for a lot of them. And so I think being able to talk about it and having the recognition and the understanding of so many people about their experience through the film feels something close to the justice that none of them got.
Yeah, I mean, we had a screening at the Apollo Theater in New York, where we brought a lot of the former prisoners and others to it. And we had a psychotherapist there, and who had worked a lot with prisoners. And we announced in the beginning of the film that she'll be in the back of the room if anybody wants to talk, and a couple of people did. I think that a bunch of people were really emotionally affected by seeing the film, by seeing it cut together, by seeing, their testimony, but the footage again. They were, in so many ways. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, for just regular audiences, when we show the film, I mean, they're just shocked. Many times people come up to us and like, just speechless. But if you can imagine, that was your life and seeing it there. And we've tried to work with the former prisoners and everybody as much as we can, after we've made the film.
Yeah, and so many of them were so young at such an impressionable time in their lives too. I mean, that stood out when you saw, the age they're at now, 50 years later. I was struck by when someone said, we didn't get justice, all we got was money. And even then, it took 30 years to get that. What was the reason for that long delay?
I don't think the state of New York was necessarily jumping to acknowledge the harm that was done by the state, or to offer any kind of restitution to those people. And for the families, for the prisoners, it was this 25-year legal fight with lawyers who pretty much for free worked all that time because they were so personally passionate about it. But the families essentially signed away any of their legal rights to sue the state when they signed their workman's comp checks, unbeknownst to them. And so they essentially had to do a public relations campaign to shame the state of New York into giving them that settlement. But I think the state was just going to make it as difficult as possible for any of these people to get any kind of justice or restitution for what was done to them.
So the money went to the surviving prisoners and then the families of the ones that had passed away?
Yes. Yeah.
And dispersed over all those people. I'm guessing that was not a whole lot.
It wasn't very much. The judge established classes of harm. And so Frank Big Black Smith obviously experienced horrific torture. And so he was sort of the worst. And so it went from there down to just sort of, the basic torture that they all experienced. And there were different levels that sort of dictated what amount of money. But yes, by that time, I mean, most of them were very old men at that point. And $12 million sounds like a lot, but $4 million went to the lawyers. And then once you kind of disperse it amongst all those people, it wasn't a huge amount of money.
Right. That scene, those scenes where you see them being forced to walk naked with their hands on their heads and beaten and and talking about being forced to walk through broken glass. I mean, it really does feel reminiscent of slave markets and just incredible, horrific cruelty. It's shocking. I was shocked that there was footage of it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things for us as filmmakers was that there were pictures and that there was footage. I mean, they can tell you about it, and obviously they tell you about it, emotionally, and they're great. But when they tell you about it and you see it at the same time, I think that's just incredible, and it's so interesting because for everybody in so many ways, that's the most shocking part of the film. And what I started trying to do is talk to people about the also the roller coaster ride that the film is, so that the end of the film is so devastating that it just sticks with you, but also to remember that this started out, and they talk about the fact that that things were going to change and they were going to win, and that it might start making people look at the whole prison system in a different way, and then that the devastating way it ended. So I think that's important that we remember back to the beginning of the film, where there you did that.
I love that you showed it day by day, because you had hope as you're watching, especially if you're not familiar with it, if you're a younger person or whatever, and you think, okay, maybe some reform can come of this, and then roller coaster ride is a perfect way to describe it. I mean, it was so much worse than what not only, did they, get held for, the fact that they did it, but then they were tortured on top of everything else. And then you think, well, at one point, was it Oswald who, said yes to 28 of their 30 demands? So you think, you do have some element of hope.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they were close. I mean, they were very close. If Rockefeller had come up, and just stood outside and showed some concern, would it have ended in a different way? It would have ended in a different way. Who knows exactly how it would have ended, but it was the amnesty. The whole thing really centered around the demand for amnesty.
And the fact that Rockefeller continued to foment those lies, and that prisoners had actually hurt the hostages, and didn't acknowledge the fact that it was all done by any injury or killing was done by law enforcement. It really, I didn't know very much about Rockefeller, but it certainly paints him in an absolutely terrible light. It's beyond the pale that he would, wanting to continue those lies. Despite, I wondered also about the two prisoners who were convicted of killing William Quinn, the guard. Are they still serving time? What happened with them?
So I actually spoke with one of them today. He's going to be in the film. He also kind of ultimately declined, but he's been out for a while. I'm not sure what happened to the other person, but one of them is out. He's just kind of living his life.
Were they just railroaded? I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, to hear the attorneys tell it, the way that there were so many people that were involved in the assault that no one person could really be identified who did it. And so the attorneys kind of feel like that was an unjust prosecution. But I think, the state was going to have to get its pound of flesh from somebody. And these two guys happened to be those two people. So
I wanted to ask you also about, was it called the Observation Committee?
Observers Committee.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Observers Committee. Yeah.
Observers Committee, right? Sort of how that happened and how it, talking to those folks, how that process went.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what has to be clear is that for the first 48 hours or so, the prisoners were really in charge. I mean, they had hostages, as they say, and that was the difference between Attica and so many other prison rebellions, that they had hostages. And so they, as the prisoners got together, and we talk about how the prisoners united, and they voted on who their leaders should be. And one of the first things that they asked for was that, one, the press come in so that the press could see everything that was happening. And that's one reason why the footage is so incredible, because they invited the press in and they were there filming everything. And two, that they have an observer committee who would come in and observe the negotiations that went on. And those were people of the prisoners choosing. And they were chosen for a lot of different reasons, but they were people who had worked in the prison system, who had written about prison system. John Dunn was head of, I forgot what it's called, some prison committee in the Senate. And, so they chose those people. And then, as you see in the film, they really became negotiators, much more than just observers. They were negotiating for the prisoners. And maybe that's partially because, as we show on I believe it's the second day, Russell Oswald, the prison commissioner in New York, leaves and doesn't come back.
Yeah, I think the observers were sort of their own narrative within the narrative, and kind of the journey that they took, because so many of them came in not quite understanding what their role was going to be, that they could maybe help in some way or listen. And like Stanley said, it became clear to them that that, oh, we are an integral part of this process, that these men are relying upon us to be their voice, to help them negotiate this with the prison. And we were so fortunate that we were able to get Clarence Jones. I mean, as you see, he kind of speaks for himself, the greatness of who he is in that film, but he really is kind of the moral center, I think, the moral heart of the film, and his perspective and his take on it, I think, just kind of cuts through, and particularly that last kind of sentiment that he leaves us with, that this is just something that should not ever has happened, and we were so fortunate that he agreed to be in the film. So I think he's just such a powerful voice in this story.
Absolutely, yeah. And mentioned that he's about to turn 90 and will never, ever, ever, ever forget. That was very powerful. The mark of a really great film is that it stays with you and haunts you, and that you want to know more, and you're did all those things. What stayed with me afterwards was, you talk about the roller coaster, 28 of the demands are being met, and and then Bobby Seale's coming, all these things that are like raising their hopes, and then what ends up happening. And I kept thinking, and what happened afterwards? How badly were they tortured afterwards for what they had done? It must have, that there must have been so much following it. Did you hear, after the whole thing was over, how they were treated?
Traci, I'll just say first, the torture didn't end when we ended it in the film. We just couldn't go on and on and on. We said, okay, you got it. By the time they're running over glass with bare feet and being beaten, okay, I got it. You got it. But just, you want to give some more?
Yeah. I think, Stanley felt, and so did I, that at a certain point, there's a fine line between the necessary violence that needs to be shown and getting to a point where it's kind of gratuitous and you're asking too much of the audience being in this experience. But yeah, that night the torture continued. There were 8 men put in a cell meant for one, naked, standing up all night. There were guards that came and played Russian roulette with them, pulling the trigger into the cell. Over and over again. Beatings continued. Men described hearing men screaming throughout the prison, and blood on the floors of it goes on and on and on. I just want to add this one because this is one of my favorites. Also just with 8 men in a cell, just hosing them down. They're nude. And it's middle of September now in New York State, and they hose them down until they're wet and freezing. And go on with what you're saying, Traci. I'm sorry. Yeah. And so eventually a lot of them ended up getting shipped out of Attica to other prisons, because the way that the system in New York would handle troublemakers in the prison is that they just sort of ship you off to the next place or to the next prison. But this certainly, not just emotionally, but it really continued to have repercussions on a lot of their lives. One of the men, Tyrone, who you see in the film, was in prison, I think, for another decade or two. And whenever he would come up for parole, it would come up that, oh, you were one of those 1,000 men that was involved in Attica, and it hurt him every single time. And he wasn't necessarily, he was just kind of out. He's one of the guys that was out there. Most of the guys in our film weren't people that were at the leadership table. They were just kind of there. But it continued to reverberate throughout all of their lives in various ways. For many of them, the day September 9th through 13th every year for the last 50 years has been extremely triggering and traumatic for them to this day.
I can imagine why. Wow. I feel like there should be, organizations that investigate how prisons are functioning today, because we have such a huge amount of prisoners, obviously the most in the world, and what those conditions are like. Is there any oversight whatsoever? It feels like there isn't.
I'm not an expert on the prison system. I'm sure there are. I know that there are people that do this work that are trying to sort of expose the reality. But I think, these prisons are built in these remote places behind these walls by design. It's not meant for us to see what's going on. It's not meant for us to hear in the voices of the prisoners what their experience is and what's happening to them. And so I think it's one of the reasons why, I really hope that this film can be an invitation for people to ask exactly the question, Claudia, that you just did, and to really kind of sit with and grapple with the answers to those questions.
Yeah, and I think the prison system in our country is broken, and one of the many things that are broken. I know at one point a few years back I was doing something, and I found out that in California the lobbyist for the prison guards was the largest lobby in the state of California. And so what they're lobbying for is for no oversight. They're lobbying for more people to be put in prison. I did a story on this TV show about a town that just built a prison, like on spec. It's like a small town in Ohio or somewhere. And they just built a prison. They built a state-of-the-art prison, and then, tried to get prisoners to come to the town. It was a way to provide jobs and make money. And so, I mean, it's an incredibly broken system, but obviously there are people and a lot of good people who are working to change it.
Yeah, I live in California, and I know there's more money spent in this state on prisons than there is on education. And of course, we all hear about the prison industrial complex and for-profit prisons, and I never hear anything good about prisons ever. I mean, I would imagine there's people who are trying to do something, but it just seems like such a huge task. I feel like your film, and perhaps the 13th also, should be required viewing in terms of, so people understand really what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that just I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to throw in there, one of the things, in the film that you see, and maybe it's subtle, or maybe it's not, maybe it's right up front, is the humanity, and the life and the intelligence of these guys. And that they are real living human beings, and it's not like we say that, it's not like we have a narrator, that but you see it, you see it,
Yeah.
you see it over again, and I
Get loud and clear.
yeah, I hopefully it makes people think about the other 2 million people who are in prison.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good point, because other films that have been done about prisons tend to be, talking heads and people with good intentions, sociologists, psychologists weighing in, but to actually hear the prisoners and for them to acknowledge, we realize we did the crime, we have to serve the time, but, why are we being treated like dogs? Why can't we be treated like human beings? Why can't we practice our religion? Why, all those things which, are of course fair, and even the white guy who acknowledged that he got special favors and was, sheepish about it. It was, everyone's honesty really came through loud and clear. We've reached our end of our time here, but thank you so much for this really, really compelling and important film. Stanley, I've been a fan of your films for a long time, so it's a real honor to get to speak with you. And Traci, it's lovely to meet you, and I can see how much hard work you did on this. So thank you on behalf of Film Independent, and just thank you for all of us for making this amazing film.